At the end of the 19th century, alcohol stood at the center of one of America's deepest social anxieties. In rapidly growing industrial cities, drinking was blamed for crime, poverty, broken families, and moral collapse. For many reformers, alcohol was not just a vice, it was the root of society's decline. Religious movements played a decisive role. Protestant churches and evangelical groups promoted temperance as a moral duty, arguing that sobriety was essential for personal salvation and national strength. Organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League transformed moral outrage into political power. Their message was simple and effective. Alcohol destroyed homes, corrupted workers, and threatened the future of the nation. Fear also fueled the movement. Waves of immigration brought millions of newcomers into American cities, many from cultures where alcohol consumption was socially accepted. Saloons became symbols of foreign influence and social disorder. For prohibitionists, banning alcohol was a way to restore control, discipline the working class, and protect traditional American values. By the early 20th century, temperance had evolved from a social campaign into a national crusade. Politicians began to see prohibition as a solution to economic inefficiency, domestic violence, and moral decay. What started as a call for moderation had transformed into a demand for absolute control. The stage was set for an unprecedented experiment. The question was no longer whether alcohol should be restricted, but whether it should disappear entirely from American life. In 1919, after decades of political pressure and moral campaigning, the United States crossed a historic line. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages nationwide. 1 year later, in January 1920, Prohibition officially began. To enforce the amendment, Congress passed the Volstead Act, which defined what alcohol was and what was now illegal. Any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol was banned. This included beer and wine, drinks many Americans had considered harmless for generations. The law did not ban drinking itself, but it made obtaining alcohol nearly impossible through legal means. Supporters celebrated the moment as a moral victory. They believed prohibition would reduce crime, strengthen families, increase productivity, and purify American society. Factories would run more efficiently. Homes would become safer. Cities would grow more orderly. The nation, they claimed, would be reborn. But from the beginning, the law revealed its weaknesses. Enforcement was underfunded and poorly organized. Federal agents were few, poorly paid, and easily bribed. Millions of Americans openly rejected the idea that alcohol should be illegal. What the law demanded and what society accepted were already moving in opposite directions. Prohibition was not just a new law, it was a massive social gamble. The government had attempted to regulate personal behavior on an unprecedented scale, and almost immediately, the cracks began to show. Prohibition did not end America's drinking culture. It transformed it. Almost overnight, alcohol vanished from legal storefronts and reappeared behind locked doors, whispered passwords, and hidden basements. The United States had entered an era of secrecy. Across the country, illegal bars known as speakeasies multiplied. Some were hidden in back rooms or underground cellars. Others operated openly behind false storefronts. Jazz music filled the air, and crowds gathered nightly to drink, dance, and defy the law. For many Americans, breaking prohibition became a social norm rather than a crime. Supplying these secret bars required a new underground economy. Bootleggers smuggled alcohol across the Canadian and Mexican borders, transported it along rivers and coastlines, and produced it in hidden distilleries. Homemade liquor, often called moonshine, became common, though frequently dangerous. Poorly made alcohol led to poisonings, blindness, and death. Prohibition blurred the line between criminals and ordinary citizens. Doctors wrote fake prescriptions for medicinal alcohol. Churches increased wine purchases for religious use. Police officers and politicians quietly accepted bribes or drank in the very establishments they were meant to shut down. The law had created a culture of hypocrisy. Respect for authority weakened as millions ignored a rule they considered unreasonable. Instead of restoring order, Prohibition normalized lawbreaking and set the stage for something far more dangerous. Prohibition did more than create secret bars. It created a criminal empire. By banning legal alcohol, the government handed complete control of a massive market to those willing to operate outside the law. Organized crime stepped in immediately. Criminal gangs quickly realized that alcohol was safer and more profitable than traditional crimes. Smuggling, brewing, and distributing liquor generated millions of dollars. Cities became divided into territories controlled by rival organizations. Violence became a business tool. The most infamous figure of this era was Al Capone, who dominated Chicago's bootlegging industry. His operation produced enormous profits, while bribing police officers, judges, and politicians. Capone became a public symbol of Prohibition's failure, a criminal celebrity created by the very law meant to protect society. Gang wars erupted across the country. Shootouts, bombings, and assassinations became common. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 shocked the nation, revealing how far criminal violence had escalated. Law enforcement struggled to respond, outmatched by better-funded and better-armed gangs. Prohibition did not eliminate crime, it professionalized it. Criminal networks became more organized, more brutal, and more influential. Corruption spread through police departments and city governments, eroding public trust. By trying to control alcohol, the United States had accidentally empowered its most dangerous criminals. And the worst consequences were still ahead. By the late 1920s, the promise of Prohibition had collapsed. Instead of reducing crime, violence had surged. Instead of improving public health, dangerous and unregulated alcohol was killing thousands. The experiment was failing in full view of the nation. Illegal liquor was often poorly produced and highly toxic. Government attempts to poison industrial alcohol meant to deter bootleggers only increased civilian deaths. Hospitals filled with victims of alcohol poisoning, blindness, and organ failure. Prohibition had turned a social vice into a public health disaster. Corruption became impossible to ignore. Police officers, judges, and politicians were routinely bribed. Entire law enforcement agencies were compromised. Respect for the law eroded as citizens watched criminals prosper while authorities looked the other way. The gap between legal authority and public behavior widened dangerously. Economically, Prohibition proved disastrous. The government lost billions in tax revenue from alcohol sales at a time when it needed money most. Prisons overflowed with minor offenders, while major criminals operated freely. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the economic cost of Prohibition became impossible to justify. Public opinion shifted rapidly. What had once been promoted as a moral victory was now widely seen as a national mistake. Newspapers, politicians, and ordinary citizens openly questioned the law. Prohibition had failed not because Americans lacked discipline, but because the law itself ignored human behavior. The pressure for change was building, and soon the country would be forced to admit what had become undeniable. In 1933, the United States officially brought the Prohibition era to an end. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, marking the first and only time a constitutional amendment was reversed. After 13 turbulent years, the country acknowledged that Prohibition had failed. The decision was driven by reality, not ideology. Crime had increased, corruption had spread, and public trust in law enforcement had collapsed. The government needed tax revenue to fight the Great Depression, and legal alcohol provided an immediate economic benefit. Prohibition was no longer seen as moral reform. It was recognized as a costly mistake. The repeal did not erase the damage already done. Organized crime had been permanently strengthened. Law enforcement agencies had been corrupted. Entire communities had grown accustomed to ignoring the law. Yet the end of Prohibition also marked a turning point in how the United States approached social policy. The lesson was clear. Banning a deeply rooted social behavior without public support leads to unintended consequences. Prohibition demonstrated the limits of government control and the dangers of moral legislation disconnected from reality. Though it lasted just over a decade, Prohibition reshaped American culture, crime, and politics. It remains one of the most powerful examples of how good intentions can produce disastrous results and why history must be studied, not repeated.